The question left her lips before she could stop it. Quiet, trembling, a whisper that somehow swallowed the entire room whole. It had been an ordinary afternoon in the great hall of Goliath Castle, the kind of afternoon that tasted like dust and beeswax, where pale winter light fell through the tall arched windows in slanted columns, catching the slow drift of ash particles from the grand fireplace. Fernanda Exodus had been cleaning that hall for 3 weeks now, moving through its marble corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of being overlooked. She knew the angles of every shadow. She had memorized the groan of every floorboard. She could walk the length of that hall with her eyes closed. But she had never truly looked at the portrait until that afternoon. Her son, Luca, toddled beside her with his small hand curled inside hers, wearing the oversized brown coat she had mended twice with the same piece of thread. 3 years old, and already possessed of a gravity that made older servants stop and stare, as though the child carried something ancient in the architecture of his face. He had always looked like someone, and Fernanda had always known it. She had simply been afraid to know who. The portrait hung at the far end of the hall, framed in dark gold, larger than any other piece of art in the castle. It had been there since before she arrived, draped partially in black mourning cloth along its upper edge, a detail that the other servants had explained in hushed tones during her first week. The lost prince, the heir who never returned. Alpha King Donner Goliath's only son, gone 4 years now, vanished on a border patrol during a conflict in the Eastern Territories. No body recovered. No certainty. Only the portrait remaining, a king's grief made permanent in oil and canvas. Fernanda had avoided it. Not consciously, or perhaps entirely consciously. There was something about its frame, its placement, its sheer dominance over the room that had always made her lower her eyes and move quickly past. But Luca stopped walking. He tugged her hand once, the way he always did when he wanted her attention, and pointed upward with one small finger. She looked. The world stopped. The man in the portrait was tall, impossibly so, painted with the kind of physical presence that made the surrounding canvas seem insufficient to contain him. Broad shoulders wrapped in deep charcoal armor, black hair that fell to his shoulders in heavy waves, framing a face that was all severity and structure, a strong jaw darkened by a short, precise beard, a brow that carried storms in its set, eyes that were pale gray beneath dark lashes, sharp as winter, and just as unforgiving. He stood with one hand resting on the pommel of a sword, the other at his side, fingers slightly curled as though he had only just released something. He looked like power carved into flesh. He looked like the man who had held her while she wept after a nightmare, 3.5 years ago, in a small cabin at the edge of a forest that no longer existed in her life, except as a scar. The cloth fell from Fernanda's hand. It hit the marble floor in a soft, crumpled sound. Luca, unbothered by the sudden stillness in his mother, tilted his head and studied the portrait with the calm curiosity of a child who has not yet learned what terror feels like. Fernanda's chest was doing something she could not name. Not quite breaking, not quite expanding. Something in between, like a door long sealed being forced open from the inside. She pressed her free hand flat against her sternum, as though she could slow it down, as though she could hold herself together through sheer physical pressure. That jaw, those eyes. The particular way his brow furrowed even in stillness, as though he were always thinking about something no one else could see. She had kissed that brow. She had pressed her lips to the scar above his left eye before she had known what it meant. She had watched those hands, large, careful, precise, build a fire in her hearth on a cold November evening, and she had thought then that they were the hands of someone who had been born knowing how to protect things. The sound of footsteps behind her was what broke the silence in her body. She turned slowly, still holding Luca's hand, still trembling in the particular way that begins deep in the chest rather than in the limbs. Alpha King Donner Goliath entered the hall with the unhurried authority of a man who had never been required to justify his presence anywhere, He was in his 60s, broad-shouldered where age had not diminished him, with silver threading through hair that had once been the same black as the man in the portrait. Queen Calindra walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a woman whose beauty was the kind that age had refined rather than erased, her dark eyes still sharp, her posture still carrying the memory of the girl who had stood at this man's side for 40 years. They were followed by 2 advisors and a guard. An ordinary afternoon walk through the great hall, until they saw the Omega servant standing motionless beside the portrait, her face white as paper, her white hair catching the winter light, her small son looking between his mother and the painting with an expression of pure, undisturbed curiosity. Donner stopped. Calindra stopped. Fernanda turned to face them fully. Her voice came out before strategy or fear or self-preservation could intervene, raw and unfiltered and shaking with 3 years of unanswered questions. My Alpha, why is my child's father in that portrait? The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube, extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. The 2 advisors exchanged glances. The guard's hand moved reflexively toward his sword, and then stilled. Calindra's breath stopped mid-exhale. Donner's eyes moved from the woman's face to the portrait and back again, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man reading something written in a language he has almost forgotten. Then his gaze dropped to the child. Luca looked back at him with pale gray eyes. The same pale gray eyes that had been painted in oil onto the canvas on the wall above them. The same jaw. The same particular set of the brow. Calindra made a sound. It was small and soft, and contained within it the entire architecture of a grief that had been building for 4 years. She pressed her fingers to her lips. Her eyes filled. Donner said nothing for a long moment. He was a man who had governed kingdoms and led armies, and he was now experiencing something no war had ever prepared him for. The specific vertigo of hope arriving unannounced after you have finished grieving. Who are you? His voice was controlled. The way a man controls his voice when the alternative is to break entirely. Fernanda straightened. Somewhere in the terror of the moment, she found the backbone that 4 years of surviving alone had built in her. Fernanda Exodus, my Alpha. I began service here 3 weeks ago. I came to support my son and myself. A pause. I know this must seem... The man. Donner cut through quietly, not unkindly. Tell me about the man. She did. She told it the way she had never told anyone, in full, without the careful omissions she had learned to use when strangers asked too many questions. She told them about the road through the Darkwood Forest, the one that cut between the northern and eastern territories, the one she had been traveling alone in autumn 4 years ago because she was fleeing something smaller and more ordinary than war. A landlord who had claimed her home and left her with nothing but the pack on her back. She told them about the rain, about the shape she had almost walked past in the dark, believing it to be a fallen tree. He had been lying face down in the mud, dressed in clothes that had once been fine but were shredded and soaked through with both rain and blood. 3 separate wounds she could identify by sight. One at the back of his skull that had bled enough to terrify her. He had been breathing, barely, the way things breathe when they have decided not to die, but have not yet found the reason why. She had not been strong enough to carry him, so she had dragged him. It had taken 2 hours to get him to her cabin, and she had ruined her last decent coat doing it. She had cleaned his wounds with the herbs she knew, and the ones she guessed at. She had sat up with him for 3 nights before his fever broke, praying to something she was not sure she believed in anymore. When he woke, he had not known his name. He remembered nothing, Fernanda said quietly. Not his name, not where he came from, not what had happened to him. The wound at the back of his head. He had clearly taken a blow of extraordinary force. He could speak. He could reason. He was fully himself in every way that mattered. He simply had no past. Kalindra had not moved since Fernanda began speaking. She was listening with her whole body, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes never leaving the young woman's face. "What did you call him?" The Queen's voice was careful, the question wrapped in something that was almost afraid to want an answer. Fernanda hesitated for only a moment. He chose his own name. He said he wanted something that meant beginning. We settled on Aaron. A ghost of a smile crossed her face, involuntary and immediately painful. He said it felt right. A beginning. A man with no past choosing to be defined by starting over. Donner turned away from them and faced the portrait. He stood before it for a long time, hands clasped behind his back, the broad line of his shoulders taut beneath his coat. When he turned back, his voice was still controlled, but only just. "How long was he with you?" 6 weeks, perhaps 7. She steadied herself. We came to care for each other. I know how that sounds. I know what I am and what you may think of. I am not asking you to justify yourself." Donner's interruption was firm, and to Fernanda's shock, entirely without judgment. He looked at the child again. Luca, unimpressed by the magnitude of the moment, had sat down on the marble floor and was examining a loose thread on his coat with absolute concentration. And then he was gone? I went to the village for food. It was a 2-hour walk each way. When I came back, he was gone. She had rehearsed these words 1,000 times in her own head, and they still tasted like iron. He left nothing. No note, because he knew I was the better reader and it would have been difficult for him. I searched for 3 days. I asked in every village within reach. No one had seen him. She paused. I discovered I was carrying his child 6 weeks later. Donner Goliath looked at his wife. Kalindra looked at her husband. Between them passed something that required no words. The specific language of 2 people who have carried a sorrow together for so long that its weight is evenly distributed, known in their bones. "The portrait?" Kalindra said softly, and it was not a question, but it contained one. "He looks like him." Fernanda's voice cracked on the last word for the first time. She pressed her lips together, gathered herself, and continued. "The eyes, the face, the way the brow. I have been telling myself for 3 years that I was imagining it, that Luca simply reminded me of a man I missed. But this," she gestured helplessly toward the painting. "I am not imagining this." No one in the room suggested that she was. Donner crossed to the child on the floor. He crouched down. This enormous man, this king, folding himself to the level of a 3-year-old with a seriousness that filled the room. Luca looked up at him without fear. Children rarely feared Donner Goliath, a fact that had always puzzled his advisors and warmed his heart. "What is his name?" "Luca." The king studied the boy's face in the pale winter light with an expression that had moved beyond control now. His jaw was set, his eyes were bright. "How old?" "He will be 4 in spring." The mathematics were simple and devastating. Donner stood slowly, his knees complaining in the way of a man his age, and straightened to his full height. When he turned to face Fernanda again, something in his expression had changed. Something vast and grieving had shifted, not gone, but rearranged around the frame of something new. "Your son has the eyes of the Goliath bloodline," he said. Every male born to this family for 6 generations has had those eyes. My son had them. My father. His father before him. He paused. I have not seen them in 4 years. Fernanda pressed her hand harder against her chest. She was not crying. She refused to cry. Not yet. Not here. Not until she understood what any of this meant. Then he really is. I do not yet know where my son is, Donner said carefully, and the word yet was the most important syllable in the sentence. What I know is that you have given me the first reason in 4 years to believe he may have been alive, long after we believed him lost. He straightened his coat, and beneath the gesture she could see the deliberate collection of composure. You will remain here. You will not be treated as a servant, not while we learn what happened. You and your son will have proper quarters and proper care, and I will begin immediately to find out the truth. Kalindra stepped forward and did something that Fernanda would spend years afterward failing to adequately describe. She took both of Fernanda's hands in hers, looked at her with the direct, unwavering gaze of a woman who had weathered things that would have destroyed lesser people, and said simply, Thank you for caring for him when no one else was there. The tears Fernanda had been refusing finally arrived. She did not try to stop them. On the floor between them, Luca had finished examining his thread and looked up at the queen with those extraordinary gray eyes and offered her his loose button as though it were a gift. Kalindra laughed. It was a sound none of the advisors in the room had heard in 4 years, and every one of them went still. The investigation began the same evening. Donner Goliath did not rule the way men ruled who had inherited their power. He ruled the way men ruled who had earned it, and the difference was evident in the speed and precision with which his court moved when he gave an order. Within hours, the castle's network of intelligence had been activated. Messengers rode before midnight. Older records were pulled from the archives. Border Patrol reports from 4 years prior. Witness accounts that had never been fully reconciled. Intelligence that had been gathered and filed, and never quite concluded. Fernanda was given rooms in the East Wing, away from the servant quarters, and she spent that first night sitting beside Luca's sleeping form, one hand resting on his small chest, listening to his quiet breathing and trying to understand what her world had just become. She had grown up in the outer settlements of a minor territory, the daughter of a herbalist mother who had died when Fernanda was 12, and a father who had not remained long after. She had learned to be self-sufficient the way people learn to swim when someone throws them into deep water, through desperation and the unwillingness to drown. She had worked fields and kitchens and infirmaries. She had developed the kind of competence that looks like simplicity from the outside, all her capabilities worn close to her body, not advertised. She had never expected to end up in a castle. She had certainly never expected to be the woman standing at the center of a king's search. And yet here she was, in a room with a real fire and a real bed. Her son sleeping safely for the first time in weeks, without the sounds of the servant dormitory surrounding him. And somewhere in this vast castle, the machinery of a king's will was turning on behalf of the quiet love story she had kept locked inside herself for 3 years. She pressed her fingers to her lips. She could still remember what he had felt like, how careful he had been, always, as though he sensed that she was something that could be hurt and had decided that nothing in his power would allow that. How he had laughed, not often, but when he did, it broke open his whole face, and she had found herself cataloging the sound. How he had told her, one night when the fire was low and she had almost been asleep, that he was glad it was her who had found him. That whatever he had been before, whatever he had lost, he could not bring himself to regret the forgetting, because it had led him here. She had asked him what here meant, and he had looked at her in the firelight with those gray eyes, and not answered in words. She had been 22 years old and thoroughly, permanently undone. 3 weeks passed. The castle moved around her and Luca like water around a still point. The servants who had known her as one of their own were now uncertain how to interact with her, not unkindly, but with the particular awkwardness of people navigating a hierarchy that had shifted overnight. She tried to smooth it where she could, offering help in the kitchens, chatting with the laundry women the way she always had. She had no desire to become something untouchable. She had spent too long being ordinary to pretend comfort in elevation. Luca adapted to castle life, with the philosophical ease of a child for whom all environments are equally new and interesting. He developed a particular attachment to the castle's head cook, a round-bellied woman named Sosta, who fed him honey cakes with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting her whole life for a child to spoil. He took to following the stable-master at a respectful distance, watching the horses with a solemn reverence that made the old man call him Little Shadow, with obvious affection. Kalindra visited them most afternoons. At first the visits were brief, formal, careful, the queen moving through the necessary emotional territory of the situation with the same deliberate grace she brought to everything. But Fernanda did not perform. She had never learned how and saw no reason to start now. And Kalindra, she quickly realized, had very little tolerance for performance either. So their conversations became honest, and then they became warm. And then one afternoon, Kalindra sat on the floor with Luca building a tower of wooden blocks, and talked to Fernanda for 2 hours about Karthus as a child. The specific boy he had been. The wild black-haired creature who had terrified his tutors, and charmed every dog in the territory. Who had cried at the death of a sparrow at age 7, and led his first military training exercise at 14, with the composure of a man twice his age. Fernanda listened to all of it with her chin on her hands, trying to reconcile these stories with the Aaron she had known. The man who had been stripped of all context, who had been only himself, and who had been, in that state of pure selfhood, one of the finest people she had ever encountered. She thought that was not a coincidence. On the 23rd day, a rider arrived from the eastern mountains. Donner's chief intelligence officer was a compact, quiet man named Vero, who had the eyes of someone who had seen everything and maintained his opinions about most of it. He brought his report to the king in the private war room, and Fernanda was called to attend, a fact that told her more than anything else how seriously Donner was treating her role in what had happened. The prince is alive. Vero said it plainly, the way men of his profession delivered the most extraordinary news, without inflection, because inflection made people stop listening. Kalindra made a sound like something released. Donner set down the document he had been holding with the slow care of a man who needed to not move too fast, or he might break something inside himself. Fernanda sat very still in her chair. He is being held in the Vareth Mountains, Varro continued, unrolling a map across the table. A company of mercenaries called the Ashbound. 12 to 15 active fighters, former soldiers from various territories who dissolved their allegiances after the border wars. They identified the prince approximately 18 months ago, based on a description from a trader who recognized him in one of the northern settlements. He was living freely? Donner asked. Until 18 months ago, yes. Based on what we can reconstruct. Varro traced a line on the map with one finger. After he disappeared from where Fernanda found him, he moved north for some time, still without his memory, living rough work in scattered communities. The mercenaries intercepted him on the northern road. They captured him without violence initially, offered him work, brought him into their camp. And then, once they had confirmed who he was, they made him a prisoner rather than a member. Why not ransom him immediately? One of the advisors asked. Because they are not fools, Vero said flatly. Ransom announcements reach the wrong ears. They have been waiting for the right leverage, the right moment, the right terms. They have also, he paused, choosing his words, been keeping him in a condition that maintains cooperation, not torture, control, enough isolation and enough management of his circumstances that he remains contained. The word management landed in the room like a stone in still water. Donner's expression had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded things. His memory, Fernanda heard herself say. Has he recovered it? Varro glanced at her. Our source inside the Ashbound, a young woman who delivers supplies to their camp, reports that approximately 1 year ago, the prince began demonstrating awareness of his identity. The recovery appears to have been gradual, He knows who he is. He knows where he is. He does not know. The intelligence officer paused. That you exist, he said to Fernanda, or that he has a child. The room processed this. When? Donner asked, and the word meant everything. We need 10 days to position our forces correctly. The Ashbound camp sits in a valley with one primary entrance and 2 secondary exits. A direct assault risks the prince. We need to go in quietly, in stages, disabling their perimeter forces before they can use him as leverage. Vero looked at his king. I would recommend the operation begin in 9 days, when the moon is below the mountain line and we have darkness on our side. Donner Goliath stood. He was a large man, not as tall as his son, but broader, built by decades of war into something that seemed designed for endurance rather than speed. When he stood at his full height in that room, he occupied it the way mountains occupied horizons. 9 days, he said. Arrange it. The 9 days passed with the specific weight of time that knows it is carrying something. Fernanda moved through them in a state she could not quite classify. Not hope, not fear, but something that contained both. A suspension that made ordinary moments feel both precious and unreal. She noticed things she might otherwise have ignored. The way morning light entered her room in a single gold bar that moved across the floor as the hour changed. The sound of Luca laughing in the kitchen below. The frost patterns on her window glass. The particular silence of a castle that is holding its breath. She thought about what she would say. She rehearsed conversations in her head and abandoned them all as insufficient. She thought about the possibility that he would not remember her, that the gradual recovery of his identity had perhaps overwritten the particular memories of the cabin and the firelight and the 6 weeks they had inhabited together. She thought about what it would mean to meet him again as a stranger, to introduce herself to a man who looked at her without recognition. She thought about Luca and stopped rehearsing. Whatever happened, the child was real. The child was the fact of everything, and that, she had decided somewhere in the quiet of the 9th night, was enough to build from. The rescue operation was not something Fernanda witnessed directly. She learned it in pieces afterward, from Donner's account, and from the quieter, more detailed version that Vero provided to the court record. She had been asked to remain in the castle, a request she had accepted without argument. She understood the wisdom of it even when everything in her wanted to disobey. Donner had ridden with his best men. Not as many as he might have taken in a different situation. Subtlety was the required instrument, not volume. They had gone north through 2 nights of hard riding, moving along the old logging roads that cut through the Varath foothills, arriving at the mountain valley before dawn on the 10th day. Varro's people had already been in position for 3 days, having dismantled the Ashbound's outer perimeter while their attention was focused inward. The confrontation had been brief and conclusive. 12 mercenaries against Donner Goliath's personal guard, in the dark, without warning, with their leadership already neutralized. It had not been a battle so much as a reckoning. The Ashbound had surrendered in pieces, and the few who had not were no longer in a position to consider their options. In the lower chamber of the mountain camp, behind a door that required 3 men to break open, they found Carthus Goliath. He was alive. He was thinner than the portrait, and there was something in his posture that spoke of long confinement, a wariness, a quality of stillness that was not natural to him but learned. His wrists bore the marks of restraints, though he was not restrained when they found him. He had apparently, at some point, been trusted enough to move freely within the chamber, perhaps because his captors understood that a man without allies or weapons could not escape a mountain. He turned when the door opened. His eyes found his father across the dark space of the room, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Donner crossed to his son and put his arms around him, and the man who had governed a kingdom through 4 years of grief stood in a mercenary's mountain camp and held his son without speaking, and the men standing at the door looked elsewhere. It was not the reunion Kalindra had been promised. she would have her own. Karthus rode back to the castle wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by his father's guard, saying very little. Not from injury or distress, but from the particular silence of a man who is in the process of returning to himself, who is moving through the geography of his own identity and discovering what has remained and what has changed. He remembered everything now. The border patrol, the ambush on the eastern road, the blow that had taken his past from him, the long disoriented months of wandering before he had been found by a woman on a forest road, half drowned in rain and almost finished with the business of surviving. He remembered the cabin. He remembered her. He had not stopped remembering her for 1 year, since the memories had begun returning. He had held them carefully, the way you hold something fragile, frightened to press too hard, frightened of what he might discover if he looked too closely at what he had felt in those weeks. He had been a man without a name, living on the charity of a woman who asked nothing in return, and in that stripped-down state of pure existence he had loved her with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who did not yet know that love was supposed to be complicated. He had left without warning, because one morning, alone in the forest collecting wood, a fragment of himself had returned. A flash of memory so vivid and specific that he had stood in the trees for an hour afterward, shaking. A name, a rank, a responsibility. And beneath it, the terrible understanding that he was not who she believed him to be, that he owed answers to people who did not even know he was alive, that staying, continuing to live that small, warm, borrowed life was a choice he did not have the right to make while others grieved. He had told himself he would find his way back. He had believed it completely. He had not understood what the road back would actually cost. He did not know, as he rode toward the castle in the first gray light of morning, that she was inside it. The great hall was lit against the early morning darkness when Karthus arrived. Torches in their iron brackets, the smell of wood smoke and the cold that clung to stone in winter. His mother's voice at the top of the stairs, not calling, just present, a sound he had carried in his chest for 4 years. And then her arms, and his father's hand on his shoulder, and the specific, irreducible weight of being home. He stood in the entrance of his family's castle and tried to locate himself within it. He had been gone long enough that the space felt both entirely familiar and slightly foreign, the way rooms feel when you have grown during your absence, when you are no longer exactly the shape they remember. Donner was saying something, about rest, about the healer who should look at his wrists, about the morning and all it would bring, and the word morning was doing something different than it usually did, carrying a weight that Karthus could not yet parse. And then he heard a sound from the upper corridor. Small feet on stone. He looked up. A child stood at the top of the staircase, wearing a coat 3 sizes too large, with white silver hair that caught the torchlight, and pale gray eyes that looked back at him from above. The world inside Karthus Goliath did something he did not have a name for. He knew, in the way you know things that exist below the level of thought, before reason has had a chance to assemble itself into language. He knew in his blood, in the part of him that was animal before it was royal, the part that predated titles and portraits, and the long wait of a dynasty. He knew the shape of that face, the way he knew his own hands. The child tilted his head and studied the large man at the bottom of the stairs, with the calm, measured gaze of someone conducting an assessment. Then a door opened at the top of the corridor. She came through it softly, the way she had always moved, not hesitantly, but gently, as though she understood that the world was already sufficiently disturbed and did not need her to add to it. She was wearing white, not the red of a servant's uniform, and her hair was loose the way she had worn it in the cabin when the formalities of the day were finished. She stopped when she saw him. They looked at each other across the length of the staircase. 4 years. Every day of them visible somewhere in the space between them, all the distance and the silence and the questions that had been living without answers. She had changed, not diminished at all, but deepened. the way good things deepen when they have been through fire. There were shadows under her eyes that had not been there before, a carefulness in her posture that was not fear, but was its aftermath. She was, in every essential way, exactly herself. He had never, in any life or memory, wanted to cross a room more urgently. Fernanda. His voice came out wrong, too low, too much in it. He had thought about what he would say for 12 months, and that was what came out. Just her name. Just the fact of her. Her chin trembled once and then steadied. Her hands were pressed flat against her thighs and her eyes were very bright. You remember. I remember everything. The child between them looked at his mother, and then at the man at the bottom of the stairs, and then back at his mother, conducting a small private calculation. Mama, Luca said carefully, pointing at Carthus with one finger. That man has my eyes. The sound Fernanda made was a laugh and a sob arriving simultaneously, and she pressed her hands to her face, and Carthus was already moving. He took the stairs 2 at a time and arrived at the top of them and stopped, because she was right there, and he needed to be careful with this. Needed to not overwhelm what was already enormous. He stood before her, close enough to reach, and looked at her face in the torchlight, and did not touch her yet. I left without telling you, he said quietly. I know what that cost. I know what you must have. He stopped, tried again. There is nothing I can say about it that will be adequate. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, dawn was beginning its slow arrival, the first gray seeping into the sky above the castle walls. No, she agreed. There isn't. I am going to spend the rest of my life. Don't make promises in doorways, she interrupted, and the echo of his own words, something he had said to her once in the cabin, when she had asked him to promise he would stay well, hit him with a force that rocked him back on his heels. She was watching him take it in. Something in her expression had shifted, not softer, exactly, but less defended, as though the fact that he remembered her exact words was evidence of something she had needed to verify. Carthus looked down at the boy beside her. Luca had not moved. He was still conducting his assessment, gray eyes moving between the adults with a seriousness that would have been comical in any other moment. May I? Carthus asked, the question directed at both of them equally. Fernanda said nothing. She stepped back, very slightly, which was the only answer that mattered. Carthus crouched down to his son's level. Up close, in the torchlight, the resemblance was something beyond similarity. It was repetition, the same face in miniature, the same particular quality of attention that Donner Goliath had photographed in his own son 100 times and could see from across a room. The child had his mother's coloring, the silver-white hair that caught light like water, but everything else was unmistakable. I know who you are, Luca said, because he was 3 years old and had not yet learned that some truths are too large for immediate delivery. Carthus's voice was a low, fractured thing when it came. Do you? Mama has your picture. Luca pointed at Carthus's face. In here. He pressed 2 small fingers to his own temple, which was apparently Luca's way of indicating memory. She looks at it sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep. Behind him, he heard Fernanda make a sound. Carthus opened his arms. Luca considered this for approximately 1 second, a very long second, in which everything that mattered was in suspension, and then walked into them. The prince of the Goliath line, who had led armies and governed borders and survived 4 years of loss and captivity, knelt on the stone floor of his family's castle and held his son for the first time. And the world that had been fractured for 4 years began, in the way of fractured things that have waited long enough to find its seams. The days that followed were not easy. They were too full for easy, too densely populated with emotion and adjustment, and the particular complication of building something real in the ruins of something that had almost been destroyed. Carthus healed slowly. Not his body. His body was efficient in the way his body had always been, knitting back together with the speed that annoyed his healers because it gave them less time to fuss. The other healing was slower, less legible, more important. He spent a great deal of time with his father in the war room, not strategizing, but sitting. Donner had learned, in the years of his son's absence, the particular value of presence over speech. They would sit on opposite sides of the long table with wine neither of them was drinking, and speak in increments about what had happened, each conversation moving a little further into the territory neither had been able to reach before. He spent time with his mother. Kalindra had always known her son better than he knew himself, and this was still true. She did not ask him to explain himself or to be recovered faster than he was. She sat with him in the mornings when he woke early and could not sleep, and she made tea, and she told him stories about the castle during the years he had missed. Small stories, domestic stories, the kind that rebuilt the texture of a life. She told him that the east gate had been repaired, and now closed properly for the first time in a decade. She told him the cook had finally trained a proper assistant and stopped terrorizing the kitchen staff. She told him the winter had been unusually mild. She did not tell him how often she had stood before his portrait and talked to it, because some things are for the privacy of a mother's grief and do not need to be said aloud. With Fernanda, it was more complicated and more essential. They were not, in those first weeks, the people they had been in the cabin. That was appropriate. The cabin had been a particular suspended universe, outside time and consequence, where a man with no past and a woman with no future had found each other in the middle of a vast present tense. This was different. This was the world with all its dimensions. This was who they actually were. He was a prince, an heir, a man whose return had reshaped the political landscape of a kingdom. He had duties, obligations, a court that watched everything, a public role that was both armor and cage. He was learning to be himself again, not the man before the amnesia, not the man in the cabin, but the man who contained all of those selves and carried them forward. She was a woman who had raised a child alone for 3 years on pride and herbalism and an unbroken refusal to ask for anything she had not earned. She was smart in the way that people become smart when no one teaches them formally, through practice, through error, through reading everything available in conditions of poor light. She was stubborn with the specific stubbornness of someone who has had to be their own argument for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to be agreed with. They were both, in their own ways, still learning that they did not have to do everything alone. He came to find her in the castle's herb garden on a cold afternoon 3 weeks after his return, because he had noticed that she went there when she needed to think, and he needed to talk to her in a place where neither of them was performing for anyone. The garden was dormant, most of it bare and brown under winter's hand, but the structure of it remained. The stone paths, the raised beds, the old iron gate that gave onto the eastern courtyard. Fernanda was standing at the far end with her arms crossed over her chest, her white hair loose and moving slightly in the wind, looking out over the bare beds with an expression he recognized. It was the expression she wore when she was working through something she hadn't figured out yet. He came and stood beside her. Not too close. He had been careful about proximity since his return. Careful in a way he had not been in the cabin, because this was not the cabin, and she had not consented to anything except his presence in the general geographical sense. "I know you're afraid," he said, without preamble. She didn't look at him. "I know you know. I'm not going to tell you there's nothing to be afraid of. I'm not going to tell you it will be easy, or that the court will be perfectly welcoming, or that nothing will be complicated. I can't promise you easy." Now she looked at him. Her eyes were direct, always had been. The quality of gaze that had startled him the first time he woke to find her watching his fever, and had never stopped being something he wanted aimed at him. "Then what can you promise?" "Honesty," he said. "I promised you honesty once, in the cabin, and then I left without explanation, because I thought I was protecting you. I was wrong. I have thought about that every day for a year." He paused. I will never again make a choice that affects you without telling you why." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dead garden around them, the particular sound of winter in a place that has forgotten it will eventually be spring. "You said you left because you remembered who you were," she said carefully. "Because you had a responsibility." "Yes." "And you didn't come back because you were captured." "Yes." "And before you were captured." She stopped, started again. "Were you looking for a way back to us?" He looked at her steadily. "Every day." The breath she took was slow and deliberate, the kind that is doing double work, moving air and moving something else, something heavier. She turned back to the bare garden and was quiet for another moment. "I built a life," she said. "I built it from nothing, and it is mine. I know how to carry it. I don't know how to be—" She gestured, a small, frustrated motion that took in the castle behind them, the magnitude of all of it. "Carried." She made a sound of agreement that was also a sound of resistance. "You don't have to be," he said. "I'm not asking you to put down your life. I'm asking if there is room in it for what is already there. What was already there before either of us understood what it was." She turned to look at him again. He waited. There were things about Carthus Goliath that the world saw, and things that the world did not. The world saw the prince, the broad shoulders and the black hair, and the face that was designed, architecturally, to communicate authority. It saw the stride and the bearing, and the way a room shifted when he entered it. It saw the sword on his hip, and the command in his voice when he issued it, the particular quality of stillness in him that held more danger than movement in other men. The world saw the warrior, the heir, the Iron Prince, as they had begun calling him again, the name that had circulated through the court in the days since his return like something recovered from storage. What the world did not see was the way he looked at her son. The specific, quiet attentiveness with which he tracked Luca's movements through a room, the involuntary softening of everything severe in his face when the child laughed. The evening she had watched, from the corridor doorway, as Carthus read to Luca from a book of illustrated maps, the child sitting entirely in the lee of the man's enormous frame, and the absolute care with which that arm was curved around the small body, not possessively, not dramatically, but in the manner of something entirely certain of its purpose. The world did not see the way he moved when she was cold, not drawing attention to it, not making it a gesture that required acknowledgement, simply ensuring that she was no longer cold. A cloak transferred between hands, a door closed, a fire built before she asked for one. The world did not see what she saw in the garden that afternoon. The man beneath the prince, stripped of all his titles and his court, and the particular performance of power that he wore in public, standing in a dead garden trying to tell her something true. She had spent a year building him out of memory. She had thought sometimes in the careful, honest part of herself that the man in her memory was inevitably better than the reality, that grief and longing had polished him into something no actual man could live up to. She had been wrong. "There's room," she said. His exhale was not quite visible, but she heard it. A long, slow release of something held. He did not move toward her. He simply said, "Good," and the word carried everything. Spring came early to the Goliath territory that year, or so the gardeners said, though Fernanda suspected they were exercising a degree of poetic license. There were certainly crocuses by the 4th week of the new year, which was earlier than usual, small purple flames pushing up through the frost-hard ground in the castle gardens, the kind of sight that makes people say things about hope without intending to. Luca found the first one himself and carried it to his mother with the gravity of a child delivering important news. The court had been adjusting. It had not been uniformly gracious about this. Courts rarely are when the established order is revised by the arrival of an Omega woman with no lineage and a toddler, and the claim, however unspoken, that she had once loved the lost prince in a forest cabin. There had been murmuring in the corridors that Fernanda was mostly immune to, having developed excellent peripheral hearing and a philosophical relationship with other people's opinions. There had been more formal resistances from advisors who had political reasons for preferring a different kind of match for the heir. Donner Goliath had addressed these resistances in a single session of his advisory council, which had lasted approximately 20 minutes, after which no further formal resistance was registered. Kalindra had taken a different approach. She had simply made Fernanda visible, invited her to sit at table, to attend court functions, to be seen beside the Queen in contexts where being seen beside the Queen meant something. Not as a project or a statement, but because Kalindra genuinely liked her, and Kalindra had been a queen long enough to know that the fastest way to normalize something is to behave as though it already is. The people of the castle had come around more organically, which was always the way with servants and ordinary folk. They watched real behavior more carefully than the nobility did, and what they observed was a young woman who worked hard and spoke honestly, and loved her child without performance, and treated everyone the same regardless of rank. They observed Karthus, returned and altered, and clearly still finding his way, becoming visibly more himself in her presence. They observed Luca, who had distributed his affections across the castle staff with cheerful impartiality and was already beloved. People warmed to what was real. That, Fernanda had learned, was the most reliable thing about human nature. There was an afternoon in early spring when Karthus found her in the library. She had been reading, actually reading, with the focused pleasure of someone who had spent most of her life with books she borrowed and never enough time to read them. The castle library was something she had not yet fully processed the existence of. 3 rooms of floor-to-ceiling shelves, good light from south-facing windows, armchairs deep enough to disappear into. He came in quietly, which was characteristic of him. For all his physical magnitude, he moved without announcement, with the particular grace of someone trained to approach without warning. He saw her reading and started to back out. "You don't have to go," she said, without looking up. He came in, then. He took the armchair across from hers and picked up a map from the side table. Not because he wanted to read it, she suspected, but because he needed something to do with his hands. He had that quality. The quality of a man who is always slightly uncomfortable with stillness, who would rather be moving or building or solving something, but has learned that rest is also a discipline. They sat in companionable quiet for a while. The fire crackled. Outside, the early crocuses were doing their quiet work in the cold. "I have been thinking," he said eventually, "about what the court expects." She looked up. "Not about what I expect," he clarified, reading her expression with the accuracy that still occasionally startled her. "About what they expect, and about the difference. What does the court expect?" He set down the map. A formal arrangement, something legible to the political structure, an announcement. He paused. "What I have been thinking about is whether you would find that completely intolerable." She studied him. He was looking at the fire, the strong profile of him outlined in its light, the jaw and the brow and the careful stillness that he put around difficult things like armor. "Are you asking me," she said slowly, "in the most roundabout way possible, whether I would consider marrying you?" He looked at her then. Something moved in his expression. Not embarrassment, exactly, but a vulnerability that he did not often show in rooms with more than one person in them. "The direct version," he said, "is that I have been in love with you since you dragged me out of the mud, and I have known it since before I knew my own name, and I would like the rest of my life to occur in your vicinity, if that is something you are willing to consider." Fernanda set her book down. She considered this. The fire moved in its grate. Somewhere in the castle she could hear Luca's voice carrying through a corridor, bright and specific, the laugh she would know at any distance. "You're not subtle," she said. "I'm aware." You could have led with that instead of the political preamble. "I was working up to it." 4 years, she pointed out. "We have been doing this for 4 years in various forms, and you were working up to it." His expression did a complicated thing that was not quite a smile, but was close to one. I wanted to be certain you had genuinely chosen, rather than been carried along by circumstances. She looked at him for a long moment. This man, who was ferocious in every arena the world had constructed for him, in battle and in governance, and in the particular authority he carried in public spaces, and who was now sitting in a library armchair, making absolutely certain that she understood she had options. She got up from her armchair. She crossed the rug between them and sat on the arm of his chair, which was impractical and undignified and exactly what she wanted to do. He looked up at her with those gray eyes and said nothing. She took his face in both her hands, the jaw she had memorized 4 years ago in a different kind of firelight, and kissed him. It was, in its way, exactly as she had remembered it, and entirely different, because they were different, because 4 years had passed, and they were both carrying more than they had been when they first met, and the weight of that was present in every point of contact. His hands came up and found her waist with that same careful certainty she had always found devastating, and she thought, briefly and vividly, that this was what it felt like to come home to something you had built yourself. When she drew back, his eyes were open. "Yes," she said simply. The wedding was held at the end of spring, when the castle gardens were at their most absurd in their beauty, the kind of bloom that seems to be overcompensating for the length of the winter, every bed competing to produce the most extravagant color, the roses opening all at once as though they had received the same notification. It was not a small affair. A royal wedding in the Goliath territory was a public event, a political statement, a gathering that required the presence of representatives from every allied domain. The court had devoted 4 months to the logistics, and the senior advisors had devoted the same 4 months to a set of concerns that Donner Goliath had addressed individually and specifically over a series of very direct conversations. Fernanda had attended to her part of the preparation with the same practicality she brought to everything, which had occasionally bemused the castle's event staff, who were accustomed to the manageable anxieties of high-born women and were not quite equipped for a bride who had opinions about efficiency, and kept suggesting that various ceremonial elements could be condensed. Kalindra, who found this entirely delightful, had gently redirected her on several occasions. On the morning of the wedding, Fernanda sat in the rooms she would leave for the last time that afternoon, and looked at herself in the mirror, and tried to locate what she felt underneath the morning's momentum. She was wearing ivory. Kalindra had selected the fabric, and Fernanda had deferred, partly because she trusted the Queen's judgment, and partly because the alternative was spending weeks immersed in the logistics of formal dresses, which she did not want. The result was something that managed to be both simple and magnificent. Ivory silk without ornamentation, cut in a way that did not look like it was trying to look like anything except itself. Luca, dressed in a miniature formal coat that he was already trying to remove, came and stood beside her in the mirror. "Mama looks different," he announced. "Good different or bad different?" He considered this with the philosophical rigor of a recently turned 4-year-old. Like the castle on the festival day, he decided, when they put the lights up. She laughed. She put her arms around him and pressed her face into his silver-white hair and breathed for a moment in the way she had always breathed him in. The specific smell of her child, the anchor of him, the thing that had been more real than anything else for 3 years. "Are you ready?" Kalindra's voice from the doorway. Fernanda straightened. She looked at herself once more in the mirror. The woman in ivory, the white hair loose for the last time before her crown went on, the dark eyes that had seen enough to know the difference between fear and anticipation. She was ready. The great hall had been transformed. The black mourning cloth that had trimmed the portrait of Carthus was gone. The portrait itself remained. It would always remain, a record of a particular moment in this family's life. But it was no longer a memorial. It was simply an image of a man who still lived, who was downstairs waiting for his bride, who had spent the morning pacing the length of the east courtyard, while his father watched with poorly concealed amusement, and his mother told him to stop wearing a path in the stones. When the doors opened and Fernanda walked in, Karthus stopped pacing. He was standing at the front of the hall with the particular stillness he deployed when he was managing something large, wearing black and dark gold, his long hair back, the formal uniform of his rank doing what it was designed to do, and being completely insufficient to contain what was underneath it. He watched her come down the length of the hall, and something in his face was completely unguarded for the first time since his return. All the careful management of his expression simply absent, the way walls disappear in earthquakes. Not destroyed, just irrelevant. Luca walked beside his mother, holding her hand, also wearing black and dark gold, his expression one of deep concentration at the task of walking slowly and formally, which was contrary to his instincts. When they reached the front of the hall, Luca released his mother's hand and went to stand beside Karthus with the decisive movement of someone taking his position. Karthus looked down at him and offered his own hand without comment, and the boy took it, and the hall breathed. The ceremony was spoken in the old form, the binding words of the Goliath line, which were long and beautiful, and which Fernanda had asked Kalindra to translate for her 3 weeks earlier, so she could understand what she was agreeing to. She had found them thorough and accurate and had approved. When it came to her part, she spoke clearly. The acoustics of the great hall were good. Her voice did not shake. Karthus's voice did not shake either, but his hands, when he put the ring on her finger, were not entirely steady. And she noticed, and it was the detail she would remember most vividly from all of it. This fierce, contained man, undone by the particular ceremony of choosing her. There was a moment, near the end, where the hall went completely quiet, that specific, held-breath quiet that a large room of people can produce when something real is happening inside it. The officiant had just finished speaking. Karthus and Fernanda were looking at each other in the way of two people who have arrived somewhere after a very long journey, taking the measure of the distance covered. Luca, who had been standing very well for 4 full minutes, chose this moment to whisper, in the carrying whisper of a child who does not understand the difference between whisper and audible. "Papa, when is the food part?" The hall laughed. All of it, all at once. The kind of laughter that releases something. The particular tension of a ceremony that has been weighted with meaning, finding its human dimension again in a child's question. Karthus looked down at his son with an expression of absolute helplessness and total love. Fernanda, whose eyes were bright, pressed her lips together. "Soon," Karthus told Luca gravely. "The food part is very soon." "Good," Luca said, and settled back into his formal posture. The celebration afterward went on until the castle's fires burned low. There was food, and there was music, and there was dancing. The kind of dancing that starts formally and becomes something else by midnight. Fernanda danced with Donner, who moved with the deliberate care of a man who had been a good dancer once and was working from memory. She danced with Kalindra, who was precise and wonderful, and who told her, mid-dance, that she had never seen Karthus look at anything the way he looked at her, and that this had been true even when he did not know his own name. She danced with Karthus for a long time in the middle of the night, when the formal music had given way to the slower, simpler rhythms that the musicians fell into when they were playing for themselves. They moved together the way people move who know each other's bodies, not perfectly, but honestly, with the small adjustments of familiar proximity. "How do you feel?" he said against her hair. She considered the question. Outside the castle's high windows, the spring night was clear, the kind of clear that makes stars look close enough to touch. Inside, the fires and the candles made everything gold. "Like the end of something," she said. And then, "Like the beginning." He drew back just far enough to look at her face. She looked back. "Both," he said. "Both," she agreed. Luca was asleep by this time, transported to his new rooms by Sosta the cook, who had taken custody of him with the authority of someone who has been waiting all evening for permission. He slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a child who has eaten his fill and been universally adored, in a room that was warm and safe, and now, permanently home. In the years that followed, the Goliath Castle was the kind of place that visitors noticed had something particular in its atmosphere, a quality of life that was different from other royal courts, less formal, more inhabited. Guests commented on it and could not always explain it. Donner Goliath smiled when they said so, the smile of a man who knows exactly what they are referring to. Karthus became, in time, the ruler his family had raised him to be, and the man his experiences had shaped him into. And the combination was something unusual. He was known in neighboring territories for being direct and fair, for the particular quality of his decisions, which seemed to emerge from a consideration of consequences that went beyond the political. He was known among his own people for being present in a way that princes were not always present, for walking the eastern borders himself, for sitting in the market court without a full guard detail, for the fact that ordinary people did not find him frightening. He was not a soft man. No one who knew him would have used that word. There was iron in him, genuine and deep, and it had been tested enough times in enough circumstances that no one was confused about what he was. When the territory was threatened, and it was threatened twice in the years following his return, he was unambiguous. The men who tested the borders of the Goliath domain in those years encountered the full consequence of their miscalculation, and the territories around them took note. But the ferocity that the world observed in him was a thing held separate, contained, deployed where it was required, and then set down. His people never felt its weight. His family never felt its edge. He came home the way people come home when home is the thing they nearly lost. With the particular gratitude that makes ordinary evenings precious, that makes the light through the window at the end of the day look different than it looks to people who have never had to go without it. He came home to Fernanda, who was usually in the middle of something, the herb garden she had claimed and expanded, or the correspondence she had taken up with healers in 3 territories, or a conversation in the kitchen with Sosta that had been going for 2 hours and would go for another hour regardless of the fact that dinner was nominally being prepared, or simply reading in the library in the armchair that was now permanently hers. He came home to Luca, who grew into himself with the specific inevitability of a child who has had exactly the right combination of love and liberty, fierce and curious and kind, gray-eyed and serious in the manner of the Goliath men, but with a warmth that was his mother's, the laugh that came suddenly and opened his whole face. He came home to the sound of the castle alive around him, the specific sound of a place inhabited by people who are well, the particular acoustics of ordinary happiness. There were harder times, too. Years that were not uncomplicated, decisions that cost something, losses that could not be argued away. Fernanda miscarried once in the 2nd year, and the grief of it was real, and was allowed to be real, and they went through it the way they went through everything difficult, together, without pretense, with the understanding that some weights are simply weights, and must be carried until they are not. A daughter came after. Mira, born in spring, with her mother's white hair and her father's gray eyes and a personality that made itself known from the first hours, opinionated and clear. Luca was 5 when she arrived, and approached the situation with the gravity of a child who has accepted a responsibility, which made everyone who witnessed it simultaneously laugh and feel something too large for laughter. Donner held his granddaughter in the same room where he had first seen his grandson's eyes, and Kalindra stood beside him with her hand on his arm, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Some things do not require language. Some things are simply true in the way that stone is true, in the way that seasons are true, in the way that certain kinds of love are true. Not despite having been through difficulty, but partly because of it, carrying in their structure the record of what they survived and emerged from. In the great hall of Goliath Castle, the portrait remained. It had been fully restored after the mourning cloth was removed, cleaned, reframed, given back the dignity of its original placement. The man in it looked out over the hall with those gray eyes, one hand on his sword, the other at his side, caught in a particular moment of his life that was neither beginning nor end, but simply a point in the ongoing fact of him. Luca, at 5, at 7, at 10, would occasionally stop and study it. He had a habit of this, of looking at the portrait, and then looking at his father, and then back at the portrait, in the manner of someone checking a reference. It amused Carthus, who never asked what he was looking for. One afternoon, when Luca was 7, he asked about it directly. Not about the portrait, about the beginning of it, about how he had come to be there, about the road and the forest, and the woman who had dragged a man out of the rain and kept him alive, and loved him without knowing who he was. Fernanda told him the story. Not a child's version of it, not a simplified thing, but the real version, with all its gaps and its fears, and its 4 years of silence and the morning in the great hall, when she had looked at a portrait and asked a question that changed everything. Luca listened with the particular quality of attention he had inherited from both of his parents, complete and still, nothing in him elsewhere. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were brave." Fernanda looked at her son in the afternoon light. "I was just honest," she said. "I asked what I needed to know." Luca considered this with the solemn attention of a 7-year-old processing a philosophy. That's the same thing, he decided. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that carries too much for its own size, that contains years in a single expression. Outside, through the high windows of the castle, the gardens were beginning their spring work again, the slow, reliable insistence of things that grow. The crocuses first, then the roses, then everything else in its order, the way the world reasserts itself after winter with the patience of something that has never doubted it would. Inside, the fires burned warm. The castle held its people. The portrait looked out over the hall, the man in it no longer a memorial, but a record. A record of a moment before the story had found its shape, before the losses had been recovered and the distances closed and the questions asked and the answers given. A record of a beginning that had not known it was a beginning. The great hall of Goliath Castle had once been a place where grief was maintained, and absence was honored with dark cloth and careful silence. It had been the room where a mother spoke to a portrait of her lost son, and a king stood with his back to the door so no one could see his face, and the servants walked quickly past with their eyes down. It was different now. It was the room where a boy had stopped walking and pointed upward and said simply that the man in the portrait had his eyes. It was the room where a woman with trembling hands had asked a question that she had spent 4 years not knowing she needed to ask. It was the room where something broken had first recognized the shape of its mending. It was, now, the room where Luca did his lessons in the morning, because the light was good, and where Mira had taken her first steps on the cold marble, and where Carthus had danced with his wife until the fires burned low, and where Donner Goliath sat sometimes in the evenings with a cup of wine and no particular agenda, simply present in the life that had returned to his house. Every room is made of what happens in it. Every space carries the memory of its occupants in the texture of its walls, the particular quality of its silence, the way light moves through it at different hours. The great hall of Goliath Castle was made now of all of it, the grief and the recovery, the question and the answer, the portrait and the man it contained, and the life that had persisted around him while he was lost. Made of a woman who had stopped walking and truly looked. Made of a child with gray eyes who saw himself reflected in oil and canvas and did not yet understand what it meant, but felt, in the uncomplicated way of children, that it was important. Made of love that had begun in a forest in the rain with no witnesses and no guarantees, and had found its way here, across 4 years of absence and uncertainty, because some things do not ask permission to continue. Some things simply do. The portrait looked out over all of it. And in the evenings, when the hall was full, and the fires were lit, and the sound of the castle carrying its people echoed through its corridors, the man in the painting no longer looked like a memorial. He looked, simply, like someone who had come home. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.